Okay, good morning, good afternoon. This is Dr. Ted Booth again, Religion 325, Religion in America. I'm attempting to share my screen with you a little bit today, so it's going to be a little bit different. So if I stumble around here, I ask for your forgiveness. But we're going to be looking at some books. This is our main textbook, which is The Religious History of America. And this is another book that I want you to get called The American Gospel by John Meacham. John Meacham's a great presidential historian, and he writes a book about how religion, quote, Christianity, played a role in the founding of America. And I think it's probably a little different than a lot of people want to think, but there's no doubt that there is religion in the public sphere even today. And as I said, I am going to try to share my screen with you all today as we talk about the beginnings of religion in America. And usually, when we think about the beginnings of religion in America, I think we think about the Pilgrims. You know, what images they bring up. Usually the Pilgrims and the Puritans don't always bring up the best images because they wanted religious freedom for themselves. They didn't necessarily want it for anybody else. They came searching religious freedom. Yes, they wanted to practice as they saw fit. But if you came and you had some weird ideas, they weren't going to allow that at all. If you remember the Salem witch trial thing, in 1692, 20 people were executed, and most of them were women, all because they had religious experiences or said they had religious experiences that the Puritans found reprehensible. So they didn't like it, and they didn't want anything to do with it. Also, it's good to know that the first Jewish synagogue in America was in 1729. Slaves that came from Africa often brought African religions with them to America, to the colonies, but they also often brought Islam with them. There was a big stink a while back when someone tried to involve Islam in the founding of the nation, but it was the religion of many of the slaves. So there were people practicing as best they could in an enslaved idea, the religion of Islam early on in America. So we were kind of culturally diverse from the beginning, even if we didn't want to admit it. But today I wanted to talk a little bit too about the idea of what was here before we came, because it's easy to say, well, the beginning of religions in America. Well, don't forget the Native Americans. Don't forget the indigenous people, the first people. There's lots of different names they're called by now. We hopefully all know that Columbus called them Indians because he felt like that he had gone to the West Indies, which he did not. But I want to share this screen with you to show you why it is difficult to study Native American religions. And if you see right here, you can see the many different kind of religions and the many different names. These are all the different tribes, and each tribe had a different religion, a different understanding. You may think, well, they're right on top of one another. Yes, but they didn't have Facebook or newspapers or anything like that. So they often were quite isolated in the fact that they were on top of one another. And so there was a lot of stuff going on here. And even if you look into Native American religion, you're going to see quite a mix of different peoples. We think of the Aztecs and the Incas, but there were all kinds of folks out there practicing all kinds of different religions. I will say about the folks in Central America, if you ever get a chance to go on a cruise again, if COVID goes away, lots of times the cruise will stop through this Gulf of Mexico and in different countries around that area, Costa Maya, Cozumel, Belize, and they're just some beautiful places. And you can actually take little excursion trips back and see their pyramids. Now, one thing about Native American religion we need to understand is that it was very diverse. It's hard to define due to most tribes relying only on oral tradition. And as I said, we're going to try to find some common grounds. And these are the common grounds here that they centered on nature, symbolism, ritual. They often involved animals, sometimes hallucinogens. They like to get a little high in their religion, and their medicine men did as well. And if you didn't have a really good understanding of chemicals or drugs, for that matter, if they're naturally occurring, and you smoked something and you saw visions, you would think, these are really visions. But you need to study each tribe specifically to really know. But I thought it would be at least interesting to look at some of the folks from around this area, the Cherokee, and look at their creation story. And we call it a Cherokee creation myth. And one thing to know about that idea, the word myth, is it doesn't necessarily mean it's false, but it means it's a strong belief by a group of people. We might, if you were a Christian and somebody just said, well, the creation myth of Christianity, and you're like, oh, no, that's true. Well, myth doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. It just means it's that strong belief. It's kind of like the creation of America myth, that we're all patriots and we're all, looking for freedom and that kind of thing. Some of that's true, but some of it's kind of, a little bit of storytelling as well, as everything does. And so when we use the word myth here, we're not necessarily judging their belief. But the earth was a small island hanging down from the sky, and when it grows old, the cords will break and the earth will sink. And I would imagine we're all done for. And but you see how they focus very much on animals, even with the water beetle, and they'll talk about the red crawfish. They'll talk about some other things that's very interesting, I think. And even how we get the mountains and valleys. I think it's interesting, the story of the buzzard, swooping his wings down when he's tired. And this is kind of more of a cartoon looking buzzard here. But that's the idea of how certain animals got their color, how certain animals got their skill. It comes from this idea of creation. And if you look back, if you want to compare this to something, think about the Garden of Eden story in the Bible. If you know that story, how come a snake slithers around on its belly? Well, because the snake tried to deceive Eve and God cursed the snake. And that's why the snake will always try to bite the man's heel and man will always try to crush the snake. So in a way, the Native Americans were doing kind of in the same way. And once again, I'm not saying one's not true or one is true. But that's a similar story that people would look at. Oh, okay, well, even in the Garden of Eden story, how did the animals get their name? Adam named them. Well, it's very similar. So hopefully we can find a little common ground with what we see here, that it doesn't sound quite so unfamiliar. But they answered their own spiritual questions. They took natural phenomenon as spiritual signs. The red sky at night, what do we say? Sailor's delight. That means if you see a red sky at night, by and large, it's going to be good weather in the morning. Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. The sun, moon, and the stars were beings, and they moved. And some of them, even if you look at constellations, some of them look like things. Like I was talking to my kids last night about the hunter Orion, and I was pointing out his bow and arrow, and the three stars that make up his belt, that are so close together. But they saw things by the seasons. Without a calendar, how are you going to tell when it's almost wintertime? How are you going to tell when it's going to rain? So Native American religion really focused on that. And one thing too about is the idea of owning land or private property was a totally foreign concept to these folks. They thought they could own the land as much as they could own the sky. It was what the Great Spirit, or it had been what had been given to them. And so when the Europeans come and they try to say, well, we're going to buy some land here, they just really didn't get it until the Europeans started pushing them back and pushing them back and pushing them back. And unfortunately, with Native Americans as well, one of the things that hurt Native Americans the most is the lack of immunity they had to European diseases. And so just, we talk about COVID being so easy to spread, but just as soon as they would make contact with these Europeans, sometimes something like smallpox would just wipe out tribes. And so it just decimated the numbers of Native Americans just because they didn't have that kind of immunity. And one thing we need to look at is when Christian Europeans came, they of course came with this idea that they wanted to convert. And I don't think there's anything wrong with someone wanting to be a missionary. I mean, you still have to be, I think, mindful that if someone doesn't want to listen to you, or somebody doesn't, you can't force any of your views on anybody. I mean, even if you feel like you should, I mean, you're not forcing a view on anybody. It's not going to work. But the thing that came with Christian Europeans is not only did they want to take these Native Americans and make them Christians, they wanted to take these Native Americans and make them Europeans. They wanted them to put their clothes on. They didn't want them to run around, do certain things. And this is something that you can talk about that deals a little bit with ethnocentrism, of the idea that your culture is inherently superior. And that happens a lot with American Christians who become missionaries in different parts of the world. And we'll look at a little bit of that as we go through this class. But the idea that they suddenly have to make everybody put on their shirts or act like Americans or something like that. And that's not true, I mean, why can't, if this Native American young man wants to become a Christian, why can't he still embrace some of his own heritage? How does that detract? And maybe he wants to sleep out under the stars instead of sleeping in a home or something like that. And I think sometimes we see that cultural differences, even with the cultural differences between the North and the South and the states and things like that. There's a lot of things that people in the country do that people in the city wouldn't dream of, And I always joke with my nieces when they come down to visit us. I live in rural Southwest Virginia, and we were at a gas station, and this guy comes driving up on his lawnmower. And he wasn't getting gas. He just was using his lawnmower to ride around town. And that's a cultural thing of the South that you probably wouldn't see in many other places. But you got to respect people's cultures. Nothing wrong with wanting to say, hey, this is what I think about religion. But there's nothing wrong with him staying who he was. And so, as I said, this brings up the issue of ethnocentrism. Think about it, and the ethics of missionary work. Nothing wrong with trying to convert people, but are you trying to change who they are as well? And maybe if people from up north came down here and wanted us to not drink sweet tea or something like that, and so there's this thing called acculturation, which is the process of adopting the cultural traits or social patterns of another group. And this sometimes happens when you talk about religions. And especially with Native American religions, a lot of what they even talk about today, those that are Native American Christians, they have some aspects of their own religion in there. This is very important here because the Christian views of the New World were very much apocalyptic almost. They thought that America was going to be the new Israel. And for those of you who may not know, Israel in the Bible was God's chosen people, and he was going to make a covenant with Israel. He made a covenant with Israel, and through Israel, the whole world would be blessed. But Israel got destroyed basically by the Romans, and the Jews were spread out. And so the Jews weren't necessarily their own country again until around 1945. So at this time, these people thought, wait a minute, this is our opportunity to shine for God. We're being persecuted in England and the Netherlands and all this stuff. We're going to go over to America, and we are going to be that shining city on a hill. We are going to be that lamp that cannot be hidden. We are going to be God's light to the world. And I'm being a little dramatic with that, but it's true. That's what they thought. And so they came up with this idea called manifest destiny, which basically meant God had given them all the land. I mean, I know you guys are here. When Israel conquered the Palestine land, they went in and kicked everybody else out because they didn't worship God. Well, these people felt like they had the same right to do that. And they came up with this idea called American exceptionalism. And this is something that's big in politics. It's not bad to believe your country's the best in the world, I don't think. It's not bad to believe, hey, I love to be an American. I'm patriotic. But American exceptionalism almost means that we can almost do no wrong. It's like we are such the beacon of liberty to the world that what we do for the whole world. And as you can imagine, that can lead to some problems. It's going to lead to the Mexican War. It's going to lead to the extermination of a lot of tribes of Native Americans. It's going to lead to a lot of persecution of things. Even slavery is going to be thrown in there with it, the religious views on slavery. But this idea that the colonists had a right to take and civilize the land. They were doing it for God, so therefore, by gosh, they were kicking the heathens out. And attempts at the conversion of the natives, as I said, would lead to syncretism of the native religion. That's a word that just basically means you take certain aspects of things around you and blend it into your religion. And lest we think Christianity doesn't do that, the interesting thing about like Christmas, the Christmas tree was a pagan ritual. Holly was a pagan ritual. Candles. About the only thing really Christian in Christmas outside of the manger and stuff is Santa Claus, because he comes after Saint Nicholas, who is an actual figure who actually gave away things to the poor. So sometimes even Christianity takes things in and makes it its own. And it's not necessarily bad if you don't change the majority view of your own religion, but the Native Americans will do that. They might not call God God, they might call him the Great Spirit. And so that is what the syncretism means. Now the Spanish, when they came with a very bold and a very idea that they were truly there to convert. They were coming out of times of the Inquisition in Europe, when basically if you didn't convert, lots of times you would be persecuted to the point of death. And so when they came on the shore, they came thinking that there were going to be all kinds of wondrous storehouses of gold and silver. And there was at first when they met up with some of these civilizations. This is a good map, shows Columbus's assumption of the world at the time. If you can see, the United States is kind of, it's outlined in white, but he didn't think it was there. So he thought he was just going to run right into the West Indies, come close to China. And that way, if he got this route, this trading route, well, we got all kinds of things going on. And this is an actual map Columbus used. It's a little hard to see, but this just shows kind of the 15th century assumptions. Well, Spain began to establish colonies, and we know people like Hernando Cortez, Ponce de Leon. He was searching for the fountain of youth. And he was searching for it in areas called Clearwater, Florida. And if you've ever been to Clearwater, Florida, oh my gosh, the springs and the water is so clear that you would have thought this is where God would have hidden the fountain of youth. And it is a beautiful place. And there was a fellow by the name of Bartholomew Las Casas, who was the defender of the Indians. But for the most part, most people weren't in favor of defending the Indians. Your book talks a little bit about, see if I can find it real quick, because I'm sharing my screen, that the Pope even said, Pope Paul III declared that the Indians were in fact human beings, not subhuman beasts. Indians were not to be deprived of their liberty or their property, and should not in any way be enslaved, whether they choose to become Christians or not. However, despite the encyclical from Pope Paul III, it did not transfer over very well. And this is a picture of the area where Ponce de Leon was looking for. And these are the areas where you'll sometimes see people with the manatees and stuff like that. And so it looks kind of ethereal or like a paradise. And I got to tell you, I've been there. If you want to go, it's a great place to go look around. So the Spanish, they basically founded colonies, alienated the natives. I mean, because if you're giving them diseases or you're telling them they're going to hell, most people don't like to hear that. And also, not only that, a lot of the Spanish were after the gold, and they found an awful lot of it in Central and South America. And now the French came along and they spread the Catholic faith too, but they weren't necessarily looking to build large settlements. So they actually got along with the Native Americans better. They wanted to live and to trap and to get some resources, spread the Catholic faith, look for the Northwest Passage. There was this idea that there was some kind of secret passage over the top of Canada. So that there was a thing that was going on, and they thought that there was a secret passage that they could go and then make it to China as well. And that's not going to end well because it's the Arctic Circle, and they weren't prepared for it and that kind of thing. But once again, when you look, you may say, why are we studying so much history? It's because these people came here to not only spread their faith. I mean, they wanted to spread their faith. They did. They were genuine. I think there were genuine, good-meaning people who came, but there were other people who came who wanted to exploit. And as I said, this is the idea that they thought that there was a Northwest Passage, and there kind of is, but as you can see, it's not exactly the easiest route to go. And so they were thinking it was going to be an easier route. We talk about Jacques Cartier, the explorer, going around Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Your book talks about him. This just shows a picture of Newfoundland today. Newfoundland, sorry, I said it wrong. And one quick thing about the Jesuits. These were like missionary monks in the sense of, they're like the monk special forces. These were guys who were really hardcore. They didn't care if somebody set you on fire. It was like, these were the guys who were going in and discipling people. And they were used to evangelize hostile situations. But they weren't always, as I said, giving people a chance to hear the gospel message, but then basically not accepting them if they don't take it. It's not a good thing. So sometimes the Jesuits could have some harsh measures. And then eventually what we're going to see is that the Treaty of Paris in 1763 would give to England all territory east of the Mississippi River and to Spain all territory west of the river. And France was mainly seen in Canada, but not really a major presence at this time. And so that's a quick look through some of the things that happened when the Europeans came. And you may say, well, we didn't say a whole lot about Native American religions. But as I said, we tried to concentrate on some of the basics of it. And one thing about this class is every time we do a little lecture or we do something, I'm going to think, man, I needed to add like 400 more things to that. And also with papers in this class, sometimes people will do a paper on an aspect of religion in America that we didn't cover that well, or we didn't cover as much as they would have liked. So we will do something like, somebody might do a paper on the Cherokee creation myth or creation myths among Eastern tribes or something like that. Something a little interesting. And then we present it in class, we get to take a little bit better look at it. Well, anyway, I've come to about the end of my time of talking. It's a little weird just to be talking to myself, but as I said, keep up with the reading, and I'll keep up with the videos until we get to see each other face to face. If you have any questions, please email me, and I hope everybody's staying safe, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.